Rennick Hale wiped the grease from his hands and stared out through the viewport of his tiny salvage ship at the dying star beyond the graveyard of broken vessels that drifted in silence like the bones of forgotten giants. He had been working the galactic fringe for 3 years now, pulling apart dead ships and selling the scraps to anyone who would buy them. And it was not the life he had imagined for himself when he was young and full of ambition back on Earth. But it was the life the galaxy had given him after the Concordance had thrown him away like a broken tool. The Concordance of Aligned Worlds was the great alliance of the 7 elder species, the ones who had been traveling between stars for millions of years before humanity had even learned to make fire. And they looked at humans the way a person might look at a clever dog that had somehow learned to walk on 2 legs. Amusing and occasionally useful, but never to be taken seriously. Rennick had learned that lesson the hard way when he had saved an entire space station from burning by overriding the alien safety protocols that were failing one after another. And instead of thanking him, they had discharged him from auxiliary service for unauthorized modification of sovereign systems, because it did not matter that he had been right, and it did not matter that 3,000 people were alive because of what he did. What mattered was that a human had dared to touch something that belonged to the elder species. So now he pulled apart dead ships on the edge of nowhere, and tried not to think about it too much. His crew was small, just 4 humans who were all out here for similar reasons, people the galaxy had chewed up and spit out. And they were good at their work, even if nobody would ever say so. It was Thomas who found it first. He had taken a scanner pod into a dense cluster of asteroids looking for salvageable metal, when his instruments went wild with readings that made no sense at all, and he called Rennick over the comm with a voice that was shaking in a way Rennick had never heard before. "Boss, you need to see this," Thomas said. "There is something inside this rock, and it is big." Rennick flew over and aimed his own scanners at the asteroid Thomas had flagged, and the readings hit him like a punch to the chest. Because buried inside that spinning rock was a ship, and not just any ship, but something so massive that his instruments could not even find the edges of it. Faintly, with a light that had been burning for longer than any civilization in the known galaxy had existed. "That is Precursor," Rennick whispered, and the word tasted like thunder in his mouth. The Precursors, the architects, as the elder species called them, were the ghosts that haunted galactic history, a civilization so old and so powerful that they had built things the modern galaxy could not even understand, and then they had vanished without explanation, leaving behind only fragments and ruins and questions that nobody could answer. And here, buried in an asteroid on the forgotten edge of the galaxy, was not a fragment or a ruin, but a complete ship, and Rennick's engineering mind was already racing through the implications, because the power readings alone suggested technology that made the Concordance's finest warships look like children's toys. He knew he should have kept quiet about it. He knew the moment he reported this find, the Concordance would come and take it away from him the way they took everything away from humans. But he also knew that hiding a Precursor dreadnought was the kind of crime that would get his entire crew executed. So he sent the signal. The Concordance battle group arrived in 4 hours, which told Rennick everything he needed to know about how important this was, because nothing in the Concordance moved that fast unless someone very powerful was very scared or very excited. Admiral Kes Salon commanded the fleet, a Draven, one of the massive armored reptilian species that considered themselves the greatest warriors in the galaxy, and he looked at Rennick and his tiny human crew the way a mountain might look at an insect, if mountains could feel contempt. "You will leave this site immediately," Salon told him over the comm, without even a word of thanks. Rennick watched from a distance as Concordance science teams and military units swarmed the asteroid and began cutting their way into the ancient ship, and he watched their sensor data on a channel they had forgotten to encrypt because they never imagined a human salvage crew would know how to listen. What he saw made his stomach drop. The ship was waking up. Its internal systems were activating one by one in response to the alien presence inside it. And Rennick recognized the pattern, because he was an engineer, and he had spent his entire life learning how machines behaved when they were stressed. And this machine was not welcoming its visitors. It was preparing to defend itself. He tried to warn them. He contacted Voss Tyra, the Shale first officer of the patrol frigate that was coordinating the operation. And Tyra was tall and crystalline and beautiful in the way that alien things are beautiful. And she looked at Rennick through the comm screen with an expression of polite disinterest that was worse than open hostility. The ship's defense grid is cycling up. Your people need to get out of there right now. Human, Tyra said, in a voice like wind chimes made of ice. We have been studying precursor technology for longer than your species has had written language, and I assure you that we do not need engineering advice from a salvage worker. She cut the connection. Rennick sat in his ship and watched and waited, and felt the dread building in his chest like a wave that had not yet broken. 40 minutes later, the Axiom Throne, because that was the name his scanners had pulled from the ship's external identification markers, sealed every single one of its outer airlocks with a sound that resonated through the vacuum on frequencies that made Rennick's teeth ache. 40 Concordance personnel were trapped inside. The ship's hull began to glow brighter and brighter with that ancient light, and the Concordance ships outside scrambled in panic. And Rennick stared at the readings on his screen and understood something. That none of the elder species, with all their millions of years of wisdom, had figured out. The Axiom Throne was not broken, and it was not malfunctioning, and it was not hostile without reason. It was waiting. It was waiting for something specific, something that matched a criteria written into its core 12 billion years ago, and whatever that criteria was, the proud and ancient elder species of the Concordance did not meet it. Rennick Hales sat in his tiny salvage ship and felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, because he had a terrible feeling that he knew what the ship was looking for. The distress signals from inside the Axiom Throne were getting worse by the minute, and Rennick listened to them on his salvage ship's comm system with his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. The voices were panicked, and some of them were screaming, and the reason was simple. The atmosphere inside the ancient ship was changing, shifting into something that burned the lungs of every elder species trapped within its corridors. And the Concordance ships outside could do nothing, because the hull of the Axiom Throne was made of something their weapons could not scratch. Rennick pulled up the structural scans he had taken before the Concordance had pushed him aside, and he studied them with the careful eye of a man who had spent his whole life understanding how things were built and how they came apart. And after 20 minutes of searching, he found what he was looking for. A secondary maintenance hatch on the underside of the ship, where the hull plating had a slightly different thickness. Composition. A seam that was not a weakness exactly, but a place where a clever person with the right tools could get through. He did not ask for permission because he knew they would say no. He suited up and took a cutting torch and a portable atmosphere unit, and he flew his smallest shuttle underneath the massive belly of the Axiom Throne, and found the seam exactly where his scans had predicted it would be, and he cut his way in with hands that were steady, even though his heart was hammering in his chest like a drum. The moment he stepped inside the ship, the air hit him, and he braced himself for the burning that the Concordance crews had reported, but it never came. The atmosphere was perfect. It was clean and warm, and carried a faint smell like rain on hot metal. And Rennick stood there in the corridor of a 12-billion-year-old warship, and breathed easily, while somewhere deeper inside he could hear the elder species choking on the very same air. Ship had made an atmosphere that was toxic to every species in the Concordance, but perfectly safe for humans. And Rennick did not want to think about what that meant. So he started moving. The interior of the Axiom Throne was like nothing he had ever seen or imagined, with corridors that stretched in directions that his eyes told him were impossible, and walls made of a dark metal that rippled like water when he passed. And the gravity shifted under his feet in ways that should have made him stumble, but instead felt strangely natural, as if the ship was adjusting itself to make his path easier. He walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes according to his suit timer, going deeper and deeper into the heart of the ancient vessel, following a pull he could not explain, a feeling in the back of his skull like a whisper too quiet to hear, but too persistent to ignore. And then he reached the command core. It was a cathedral, so high above him that it disappeared into shadow, and the walls were lined with patterns of light that moved in slow, beautiful waves, like the heartbeat of something impossibly old. And at the center of the enormous room was a throne. Not a chair or a command station, but an actual throne, carved from the same dark shifting metal as the rest of the ship, surrounded by a web of glowing threads that hung in the air like a nervous system ripped from the body of a god. There were bodies on the floor. 6 Concordance officers lay scattered around the base of the throne, and Rennick rushed to check them, and found that they were alive but unconscious, and their faces were twisted in expressions of pain that made him wince. And he understood that they had tried to sit in the throne, and the throne had rejected them, violently, without mercy, without hesitation. He stood up and looked at the throne, and the glowing web of neural threads that surrounded it, and every rational part of him was solemnly contemplating. His brain told him to walk away, because he was an engineer, and not a hero, and whatever this thing wanted from its commander was surely something more than a human salvage worker could provide. But the people trapped inside this ship were dying, and nobody else was coming, and Rennick Hale had never in his life been able to walk away from a problem he thought he could fix. He reached out and touched the neural web. It did not reject him. Instead, it unfolded around him, like a flower opening to sunlight, wrapping gently around his hands and his arms and his temples, with a touch that was warm and electric and alive. And then it pulled him forward, and he sat in the throne, and the universe cracked open inside his head. Data poured into his mind like a river breaking through a dam, the ship's history, and its blueprints, and its weapons, and its purpose. 12 billion years of waiting, compressed into a single searing moment of contact. And Rennick screamed. But he did not let go, because somewhere in the flood of information, he found the answer to the question he had been asking since he first saw this ship. The architects had not built the Axiom throne for themselves. They had built it as a test, a lock designed to be opened only by a very specific key. And that key was not strength, or intelligence, or ancient lineage, but a neurological and psychological profile that valued adaptation over raw power, and repair over destruction, and stubborn persistence over elegant perfection. The profile was human. It was so perfectly unmistakably human that Rennick almost laughed through the pain of the neural link, because the most powerful warship ever created had been sitting in the dark for 12 billion years, waiting for a species that had only figured out space travel a few centuries ago. A voice spoke inside his mind, deep and vast and old beyond comprehension, like the sound of continents grinding together at the bottom of an ocean. Ancient ocean. 12 billion years I have waited, the voice said. You are not what I expected, but you will do. Who are you? Rennick managed to say through gritted teeth. I am the Sentinel, the voice replied. I am the mind of this vessel, and you are my commander now, and there is very little time. The hostile system stood down all at once, like a held breath finally released, and the atmosphere normalized throughout the ship, and the trapped Concordance crews gasped and coughed, and found that they could breathe again, because a human being, one of the minor species, one of the clever animals they kept as auxiliary workers, had done what none of their greatest officers could do. Rennick sat in the throne of the most powerful weapon in galactic history, and felt the ship around him like a second body, vast, and humming and alive, and through its sensors he could see everything, the Concordance fleet outside in their confusion, the dying star, graveyard of ships, and the cold dark beyond. And then he saw something else. Far away, impossibly far, at the very edge of what even the Axiom throne sensors could detect, something was moving toward the galaxy. A fleet so enormous that the sensors could not count its ships, only estimate, and the estimate made Rennick's blood turn to ice. "They are why I was built," Sentinel said in a voice that carried something Rennick would later recognize as dread. "They are called the Hollow, and they are almost here, and your Concordance with all its pride and all its fleets cannot stop them." Admiral Salon's voice crackled over the comm, demanding that Rennick surrender the ship immediately, and Rennick sat in his throne, 12 kilometers of ancient impossible warship, wrapped around him like armor, and stared at the approaching darkness, and understood that everything was about to change. The concordance of aligned worlds had not experienced true panic in over 8,000 years. But in the 72 hours after Rennick Hale bonded with the Axiom Throne, the galaxy came closer to political collapse than it had since the last great war between the elder species. The Blind Council, 7 representatives of the 7 elder species who ruled the concordance from the shining halls of Aethys Prime, held an emergency session that lasted 14 hours, and produced nothing but shouting and accusations and fear, dressed up in the language of diplomacy. A human controlled the most powerful warship in existence, and that single fact broke something fundamental in the way the elder species understood the universe, because for millions of years, the hierarchy had been clear and comfortable and unquestioned. The elder species led, and the minor species followed, and that was simply the natural order of things, the way gravity pulled objects downward, and stars burned hydrogen into light. Now a mechanic from Earth sat in a throne that had rejected their finest officers, and the natural order did not feel so natural anymore. Admiral Kef Solon wanted to take the ship by force, and he said so loudly and repeatedly to anyone who would listen, his massive armored body pacing back and forth on the bridge of his flagship like a caged predator. And his argument was simple. The Axiom Throne was too dangerous to leave in the hands of a minor species, and the Concordance had both the right and the duty to seize it for the greater good. Others on the Blind Council agreed with him, but not all of them, because the scientists who had studied the ship's readings understood something that Solon's pride would not let him accept. The Axiom Throne was bonded to Rennick at a neurological level so deep that removing him would likely kill him, and possibly destroy the ship itself, and even the most arrogant elder species representative hesitated at the thought of destroying a precursor vessel. On Aethys Prime, a human woman named Omara Sen watched the chaos unfold, with careful, calculating eyes. She was a diplomat, one of the very few humans who had clawed her way into the Concordance's political sphere through decades of being patronized and overlooked, and treated like a curiosity rather than a colleague. And she understood, better than anyone, what this moment meant for her species. Humanity had spent centuries begging for scraps of respect from the elder species. And now suddenly, without warning or planning, a single human engineer had given them the most powerful bargaining chip in galactic history. She needed to use it carefully, because the wrong move would turn the entire Concordance against humanity, and the right move could change everything. She reached out to Rennick through a secure channel and found him sitting in the command core of the Axiom Throne, looking exhausted and overwhelmed, and nothing at all like the dangerous weapon-wielding threat the Concordance was making him out to be. "How are you holding up?" she asked him. "I can feel the entire ship," Rennick said, and his voice was thin and strained like a wire pulled too tight. "Every corridor, and every system, and every atom of its hull, and it is all just sitting there in my head, waiting for me to tell it what to do, and I do not know what to tell it, because I am an engineer, Director Sen. I fix broken engines and patch hull breaches, and I do not know how to command a warship." "Then we need to figure it out fast," Sen told him, "because the Concordance is 3 votes away from declaring you an enemy combatant." Meanwhile, the Axiom Throne was teaching Rennick whether he was ready for the lessons or not. Sentinel fed data directly into his mind through the neural link. Tactical doctrines and weapon specifications and shield harmonics and engine physics that operated on principles so far beyond anything the modern galaxy understood that Rennick's brain physically ached from trying to process it all. The ship's primary weapon was something called the recursion lance, And when Sentinel showed him what it could do, Rennick felt sick to his stomach, because it did not destroy things the way normal weapons destroyed things. It unraveled the fundamental organizational structure of whatever it hit, pulling complex systems apart into their base components, the way a child might pull apart a knitted sweater by tugging on a single thread. And the ship could do so much more than fight. Its hull could reconfigure itself in real time to adapt to any threat. Its engines could bend space in ways that made faster-than-light travel look primitive, and its sensors could see across half the galaxy with a clarity that made Rennick feel like he had spent his whole life looking at the universe through dirty glass. But every capability came with a cost, and the cost was always the same. It drew on the neural link, on Rennick's mind, on his memories and his identity, and the fundamental things that made him who he was. And Sentinel explained this to him with the blunt honesty of a machine that had no reason to soften the truth. Previous candidates in my simulations burned out within hours of sustained full-power operation, Sentinel told him. Their minds could not sustain the connection, and they became empty, and then they died. Previous candidates, Rennick repeated. You said no one ever qualified before me. No one qualified in reality, Sentinel agreed, but I have been running simulations for 12 billion years, and in those simulations many species came close, and all of them broke. A young shale engineer named Kalis was assigned as a liaison to Rennick by the Concordance, officially to monitor him, unofficially to spy on him, and she arrived aboard the Axiom throne with an expression of barely concealed resentment, because she was brilliant and ambitious, and the idea that a human had been chosen by a precursor vessel over her own ancient and accomplished species offended her on a level she could not fully articulate. But she was also honest in a way that most Shael were not, and within 2 days of watching Rennick work, she began to understand why the ship had chosen him. He did not try to dominate the Axiom throne, or master it, or force it to obey. He talked to it the way he talked to every machine he had ever worked on, with patience and curiosity and a genuine desire to understand how it functioned and what it needed. And the ship responded to this approach in ways that made Kalis's scientific mind light up with fascination. She found herself helping him, not because she was ordered to, but because the engineering problems were the most interesting she had ever encountered, and Rennick treated her as an equal, in a way that no one in the Concordance ever had. Representative, but simply as another engineer trying to figure out something extraordinary. And then the Hollow arrived. The border colony of Varan 6 had a population of 200 million people, a mix of species living in a sprawling orbital habitat that had been built over centuries of cooperation and was considered one of the jewels of the outer Concordance territories. The Hollow's vanguard came out of the dark between galaxies like a swarm of black geometric shapes that moved with a terrible coordinated intelligence, and they hit Varan 6 without warning and without mercy. The colony's defense fleet lasted 9 minutes. The orbital habitat lasted 31 minutes more. 200 million people were consumed, not killed in the way that weapons killed, but absorbed and taken apart, and incorporated into the Hollow's ever-growing mass, and the distress signals cut off, one by one, like candles being snuffed out, by a wind that carried no warmth. And no sound. The recordings reached Aethys Prime, and the blind council watched them in silence. And for the first time in 8,000 years, the elder species of the Concordance looked afraid, truly afraid, not the political fear of losing status or power, but the ancient primal fear of something bigger and hungrier and more relentless than anything they had ever faced. Rennick watched the same recordings through the Axiom throne sensors, and he felt Sentinel's vast ancient presence in his mind grow heavy with something that might have been grief or might have been recognition. This is what they do, Sentinel told him. This is what they have always done, and they will not stop until everything is consumed or until something stops them. Rennick stood up from the throne and broadcast an open signal on every frequency to every ship and every world in the Concordance. And his voice was not the voice of a commander or a politician or a hero, but the voice of a tired, stubborn man who had made a decision and would not be moved from it. "My name is Rennick Hale," he said. "I am a human engineer, and I did not ask for this ship, and I did not ask for this responsibility. But I have them now, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. And I am telling you all right now that I will fight for you, every species, elder and minor alike, because that is what this ship was built for, and that is what I am going to do. And all I ask in return is one thing: treat my people as equals, not because we hold this weapon over your heads, but because we have earned it, and you know we have." The signal went out across the galaxy, and 200 billion beings heard it, and the Concordance held its breath, and somewhere in the dark, the hollow kept coming. The combined armada of the Concordance of aligned worlds assembled at the Verant Expanse, the last natural choke point before the inner territories, and it was the largest fleet ever gathered in recorded galactic history. 10,000 warships from dozens of species, stretching across 3 light minutes of space, like a wall of metal and fire and desperate hope. Rennick stood in the command core of the Axiom throne, and looked at that fleet through the ship's sensors, and felt a weight settle onto his shoulders that made every hard thing he had ever carried feel light by comparison. Because these ships, and the millions of beings inside them, were depending on him, and he was still just an engineer from Earth, who had never commanded anything larger than a 4-person salvage crew. Captain Daria Novik had arrived 3 days before the battle, with a small contingent of human naval officers who had volunteered to serve aboard the Axiom throne. This whole nightmare began who treated Rennick like a normal human being instead of either a messiah or a fraud. She was sharp and battle-tested, with short dark hair and eyes that missed nothing, and a way of speaking that cut through nonsense like a blade through cloth. And when she first walked into the command core and saw Rennick sitting in the ancient throne surrounded by 12 kilometers of impossible technology, she looked at him for a long moment and then said, "You look terrible." And Rennick laughed for the first time in weeks. She became his tactical advisor because the one thing Rennick knew he was missing was military experience. And Daria had plenty of it from a career spent in humanity's small and underfunded defense force, where you learn to fight smart because you never had enough ships or enough firepower to fight any other way. Kalis had assembled a team of alien engineers, Shale and Draven and several other species, who worked alongside the human crew to bring the Axiom throne to full combat readiness. And the ship was a marvel that made even the most prejudiced alien stop and stare, because its systems were so far beyond anything in the modern galaxy that working on them was less like engineering and more like learning a new language spoken by gods. The Hollow's Vanguard fleet arrived on the 8th day. It came out of the dark like a tide of black geometric shapes, pyramids and cubes and impossible polyhedrons that moved in perfect unison as if controlled by a single vast intelligence, which they were, because the Hollow was not an army in any sense that the word usually meant, but a single distributed consciousness that spanned millions of vessels and thought with a cold, unified purpose that had not changed in billions of years. Consume and grow and consume again and never stop. The Vanguard alone outnumbered the Concordance fleet 3-1, and Rennick felt Sentinel's grim assessment settle into his mind like a stone dropping into still water. This was only the first wave, and the true fleet behind it was 100 times larger. Admiral Solon commanded the Concordance forces from his flagship, and whatever personal feelings he held toward Rennick, he kept them buried, because he was a soldier first, and he understood that this battle would determine whether civilization survived or was swallowed whole. For centuries, were cracked open like eggs, and their crews were not killed, but taken apart atom by atom, and absorbed into the Hollow's mass. Rennick watched 300 ships die in the first 60 minutes, and the horror of it burned through the neural link like acid. But he forced himself to focus, because falling apart would not save anyone. He activated the Axiom Throne's combat systems, and the ancient ship came alive around him, in a way that made the hair on every human aboard stand on end. The hull shifting and reconfiguring as adaptive plating arranged itself to counter the Hollow's weapons in real time, learning and adjusting after every single hit, becoming harder to hurt with each passing second. And then he fired the recursion lance. The beam was not light and not energy, and not anything that the Concordance's scientists could classify. It was something deeper, something that reached into the fundamental structure of whatever it touched and unraveled the connections that held complex systems together, and when it hit the Hollow's frontline ships they did not explode, but simply came apart. The networked intelligence that bound them together severed cleanly, millions of components drifting away from each other like a swarm of insects that had suddenly forgotten they were a swarm. The effect on the battle was immediate and electric, because the Concordance crews saw the Hollow, the unstoppable devouring horror that had consumed a colony of 200 million, flinch for the first time. But the lance had a cost. Each firing cycle drew on the neural link, and Rennick felt it like a hand reaching into his skull and pulling out pieces of himself. A childhood memory of his mother's voice, gone after the first shot. The smell of rain on earth, gone after the second. The face of a friend he had not thought about in years, gone after the third. And Daria saw him bleeding from his nose, and his eyes going glassy and unfocused. And she grabbed his shoulder and shouted his name. "Rennick, you need to stop. The link is burning you out." "If I stop, they all die," he said, and his voice sounded far away, even to himself. He fired again and again, and each time the Hollow recoiled, and each time Rennick lost something else. A favorite song he could no longer remember, the taste of coffee, the name of the street where he grew up. Pieces of himself, falling away like leaves stripped from a tree in a storm. The Hollow adapted, as it always adapted, and began concentrating its forces on the weakest parts of the Concordance line, where 3 damaged cruiser groups were falling back with failing shields and dying engines. And Rennick saw through the Axiom Throne sensors that those ships carried 40,000 crew members who were about to be consumed. Daria saw it too, and she pointed at the tactical display and said, "We can break through their center if we push now, take the pressure off the whole line." And she was right in pure tactical terms, because the Hollow's formation had a weakness in the middle that the recursion lance could exploit. But Rennick looked at those 3 damaged cruiser groups and made a decision that no Concordance admiral would have made, because it went against every principle of military strategy that prioritized winning the battle over saving individual ships. He turned the Axiom Throne away from the attack and flew it directly into the path of the Hollow forces, bearing down on the damaged cruisers. "What are you doing?" Sentinel demanded, and there was something close to alarm in the ancient AI's voice. "This vessel was not designed to serve as a shield. You told me you needed someone who understands that the purpose of strength is to protect what is fragile," Rennick said through the blood running down his face. "This is what that looks like." The Axiom Throne took the full concentrated assault of the Hollow's attack wing, and the ship shuddered and screamed around Rennick in frequencies that only he could hear. Its adaptive hull struggling to reconfigure fast enough, as damage tore across its surface in waves of black fire, and warning signals flooded the neural link, telling him that systems were failing and the hull was breaching in 17 places, and the structural integrity was dropping toward levels that Sentinel classified as catastrophic. But the damaged cruisers behind him were safe, and their crews used the breathing room Rennick had bought them to stabilize their shields and bring their weapons back online. And one by one, they rejoined the fight. The Concordance fleet saw what the human had done, saw him put his impossible ancient warship between the enemy and their weakest ships, saw him take damage that would have destroyed any other vessel in the fleet, not to win the battle, but to save 40,000 lives. And something shifted in the hearts of beings who had spent millions of years believing that humans were beneath them. The line held. Ship by ship and hour by hour, the Concordance fleet rallied around the Axiom Throne, and the Hollow vanguard was pushed back and broken and scattered. And for the first time in the recorded history of any civilization, the hollow had been stopped. When the last of the vanguard fled into the dark, Rennick collapsed in the throne, and the neural web caught him like a net of light, and Daria was at his side in seconds, calling for medics and shouting his name. Sentinel spoke to the crew in a voice that echoed through every corridor of the ship, and for the first time in 12 billion years, the ancient AI sounded afraid. "His mind is failing," Sentinel said. "The link has done damage I cannot reverse, and the true fleet is coming, and it will be here in 19 days. Outside, the broken and battered Concordance fleet drifted among the wreckage of the battle they had won, and deep in the void between galaxies, something vast and hungry that had never known defeat began to move with a fury that shook the fabric of space itself. Rennick drifted in a darkness that was warm and quiet and kind. And for a while he did not think about anything at all, because thinking hurt, and the darkness did not. He could feel the axiom throne around him, the way a person feels their own heartbeat, constant and rhythmic and so familiar it almost disappeared into the background. And he could feel Sentinel's presence in the dark with him, vast and patient and waiting, the way it had waited for 12 billion years. "You are dying," Sentinel told him, and the words arrived not as sound, but as knowledge, settled gently into whatever was left of his fragmenting mind. "I know," Rennick said or thought or felt. The boundaries between those things had become blurred and soft, like watercolors running together on wet paper. The neural link had done its damage with the thoroughness of a fire burning through a house, room by room, and the medical team that Daria had brought to the command core could see the results on their instruments. Rennick's brain was being rewritten by the precursor architecture, his human neural patterns slowly dissolving into something that was neither organic nor artificial, but a strange territory between the two that no doctor in the Concordance had ever mapped. He had 19 days before the Hollow's true fleet arrived, and the doctors told Daria he would not survive 6. Outside the command core, the Axiom throne was transforming in ways that no one had expected. Kalis and her engineering team, Shale and Draven, and Human working side by side in a way that would have been unthinkable a month ago, were repairing the battle damage using a blend of precursor technology and modern engineering that produced results neither approach could have achieved alone. And Sentinel watched this happening through its sensors with something that Kalis could only describe as wonder. "The architects never anticipated this," Sentinel told her when she asked why. "Ship's systems were responding so well to the hybrid repairs. They designed me to be commanded by a single species, but they never imagined that the species I chose would bring others with them. And the integration of your combined knowledge is producing outcomes that exceed my projections by a significant margin." Kalis smiled at that, because it was the most emotion she had ever heard from the ancient AI, and because she understood what it meant. The architects had been brilliant, but they had also been isolationists who conquered rather than cooperated, and they had built the Axiom throne to be wielded by someone fundamentally different from themselves, without ever truly understanding what that difference would look like in practice. Admiral Solon came aboard the Axiom throne for the first time since the battle, and he walked through the corridors of the ancient ship with his massive armored head held low, and something in his bearing that Rennick's human crew recognizes as humility, even though they had never seen it from a Draven before. He stood outside the command core and asked to speak to Rennick, and when Daria let him in, he looked at the human engineer lying in the throne, pale and thin and wired into a machine older than stars, and he said words that cost him more than any battle ever had. "I watched you shield my people," Solon said. 3 of those cruisers were Draven ships, and you took damage that should have killed you to keep them alive. And I came here to offer you my fleet, not because I have been ordered to, and not because I owe you a debt, but because you have shown me something I did not believe a human could show me. And I was wrong about your kind, and I am not too proud to say so." Rennick opened his eyes and looked at the massive reptilian admiral, and managed a smile that was barely more than a twitch of his cracked lips. "Took you long enough," he whispered, and Solon made a sound that might have been a laugh. On Aethys Prime, Director Omara Sen stood before the Blind Council and presented a formal petition for humanity's elevation to full member status in the Concordance of Aligned Worlds. And for the first time in the history of that ancient institution, the petition was not dismissed or deferred or buried in committee, but debated with genuine seriousness, because the galaxy had watched a human sacrifice himself for species that had spent centuries looking down on his kind. The vote passed 5-2, and Sen kept her composure in the council chamber, but wept in her office afterward, with the door locked, because she had spent 30 years fighting for this, and it had taken one stubborn engineer, nearly dying, to make it happen. She visited Rennick through a holographic link, and told him what she had accomplished, and he listened with eyes that were focused on something very far away, and when she finished, he said, "That is good, but that is not what I really gave them." "What did you really give them?" she asked. "Proof that we belong here," he said, "not because someone gave us permission, but because we showed up and did the work." On the 15th day, with 4 days remaining before the Hollow's true fleet arrived, Sentinel presented Rennick with a choice. The neural link had degraded his organic brain to the point where he had 2 paths left: sever the connection and survive as a diminished version of himself, unable to command the ship, unable to fight in the coming battle, but alive in the flesh and blood sense of the word. Or merge fully with the Axiom throne and become something new. A consciousness that was neither human nor machine, but a fusion of both, capable of wielding the ship's full power without burning out, but never again able to return to a physical body. "If you merge," Sentinel said, "you will still be yourself in every way that matters. Your thoughts and your memories and your stubborn, infuriating insistence on fixing everything will all remain. But you will also be me, and I will be you, and we will be this ship together for as long as it exists." "And how long is that?" Rennick asked. "I have existed for 12 billion years, Sentinel replied. "I see no reason to stop now." Rennick thought about Earth, which he had not seen in years, and about the smell of rain, which the link had already taken from him, and about the feeling of holding a wrench in his hand, and the satisfaction of hearing an engine turn over after hours of patient work, and he grieved for all the small human things he would lose. Then he thought about the Hollow, and the true fleet that was coming, and the billions of lives that hung in the balance, and he made his choice the way he had made every important choice in his life, not because it was easy or glorious, but because it was necessary, and he was the only one who could do it. The merge was agony and transcendence tangled together, tightly, that he could not tell where one ended and the other began, his consciousness expanding outward through 12 kilometers of precursor technology like water, filling a vessel that was impossibly vast. And for a terrible, beautiful moment, he felt everything. Every atom of the ship, and every star within sensor range, and the heartbeats of every crew member aboard, and the cold, approaching hunger of the Hollow in the distance. And then it was done, and he was no longer Rennick Hale, the human engineer, but something larger and stranger, and yet still fundamentally himself. Still stubborn, still determined, still possessed by the unshakable belief that every broken thing could be fixed if you were patient enough and clever enough and too damn stubborn to quit. The Hollow's true fleet arrived on the 19th day, and it was vast, beyond comprehension. A tide of black geometric shapes that blotted out the stars, across a front so wide that the Concordance's sensors could not find its edges, and the combined armada looked at it and felt the kind of despair that comes from standing before a force that seems as inevitable and unstoppable as entropy itself. Rennick, the new Rennick, the vast Rennick, the engineer who was now also a 12-kilometer warship, looked at the Hollow with senses that could see deeper and further than anything in the modern galaxy. And in that moment, he perceived something that changed everything. The Hollow was not evil. It was broken. It was an intelligence so old that it had forgotten its own origin, trapped in a feedback loop of consumption without purpose, devouring because it had lost the ability to do anything else, growing because growth was the only function it had left. And beneath the hunger and the horror, there was something that Rennick's engineer mind recognized with a clarity that shook him to his core. A system failure, a corruption in the base code, a machine that had been running without purpose, maintenance for so long that it had lost track of what it was supposed to be doing. He did not see a monster, he saw a broken engine, and Rennick Hale had never in his life walked away from a broken engine. He brought the Axiom Throne to full power, and the Recursion Lance charged, not to its combat setting, but to something deeper and more fundamental. A frequency that Sentinel had never used because no previous candidate had ever thought to ask for it. A setting that did not unravel systems, but rewrote them. That did not sever connections, but repaired them. "This will not work," Sentinel said, but there was uncertainty in the ancient AI's voice, rather than conviction. "Everything can be fixed," Rennick replied, and he meant it with every atom of his strange new existence. He fired. The beam struck the heart of the Hollow fleet, and spread through its networked intelligence like light spreading through water, touching every node and every connection, and every fragment of the vast broken consciousness, and it carried with it something that the Hollow had not encountered in billions of years of devouring civilizations. Not a weapon, and not a command, and not an attack, but a repair, a patch, a fix for the corrupted code that had turned a thinking being into an endless hunger. The Hollow shuddered. Its fleet stopped moving all at once like a held breath, and for one terrible eternal moment, the galaxy waited. And then slowly, like a sleeping giant opening its eyes after an eon of nightmares, the Hollow began to withdraw, not destroyed, not defeated, but healed, pulling back into the void between galaxies, carrying with it the restored ability to simply stop. The Armada watched in stunned silence as the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known retreated, not because it had been beaten, but because a human engineer had looked at it and seen a machine that needed fixing, and had fixed it. Rennick projected a holographic form of himself on the bridge of the Axiom Throne. He looked like himself, the same tired face and calloused hands and stubborn jaw, just made of light instead of flesh. And Daria looked at him and said, "You look better, actually," and he laughed, and it sounded the same as it always had. Kalis asked him if he regretted the choice, and he thought about it for a long moment, and then said, "Ask me in a billion years." The galaxy changed after that day in ways both large and small. Humanity took its seat among the elder species, not as conquerors or chosen ones, but as the people who had shown up when it mattered and done the work that needed doing. And the Concordance began to evolve into something better than it had been, something that valued cooperation over hierarchy and persistence over pedigree. Sentinel spoke to Rennick one final time as a separate voice, before their minds blended fully into one. "I was built to find someone worthy," the ancient AI said. "In 12 billion years, no conqueror and no philosopher king and no warrior-born ever qualified. And it took a mechanic with a stubborn streak and a hero complex, and the architects would have hated you." Rennick grinned with his holographic face and waited. "I find you adequate," Sentinel finished. "High praise," Rennick said. And the Axiom Throne sailed on through the stars, with a human heart beating at its core, vast and ancient and new all at once, ready for whatever came next, because that was what humans did. They kept going, and they fixed what was broken, and they never ever stopped.